most happy to kickstart this series of distinguished lectures with a very renowned scientist in complexity science, who was already working on complexity way before we actually called it complexity, I think. And so he was an example. He was working on crowd dynamics when most of us were still trying to walk, learning to walk, so to say. And he was working on traffic dynamics when we were, still on our little bikes with sport wheels. And he was already thinking about, making these systems that makes our life complicated, to make them, better and more intelligent, taking into account not only sociology, psychology, but also, physics and mathematics. So it's definitely a pleasure to introduce Dirk Helbing from ETH Zurich to all of you. He's one of those guys that doesn't have to worry anymore about the citation index or something like that, with a H index which is way over 70, so he doesn't have to worry about that. It's really a pleasure. I hope you all enjoy it. I know Dirk is very eager to have discussions going on. He's going to challenge us with wild ideas, I would say, and some of them are not so wild and actually quite stimulating. So I really hope that we can have a lively discussion going on during or after, whatever, it's up to you, this presentation. So join me in welcoming Dirk Helbing.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be back in Singapore, a wonderful city and country. And today I'm going to talk about building a smart digital society together. That means all of us. The problems of the world are complex. We are faced with climate change on a scale of, say, 30 to 50 years. We are seeing it now already. We are faced with an energy crisis. We need to rebuild our systems towards renewable energy. And in fact, we'll run out of oil in a couple of decades, and this will produce a number of dramatic problems, in particular as we are using oil not only to drive our cars and fly planes, but also to produce fertilizers, plastic, and many other things that have become so important for our lives. On the same order of time, we're seeing a digital revolution happen. So basically, computers are getting into this range where they will overtake the complexity of the human brain. And the question is, how is this going to change our society? We already see that parallel to this development, cybercrime is exploding exponentially and is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Every year now, up to $3 trillion are being wasted through cybercrime. And maybe even more worrying is cyber war, because basically within the fraction of a second, you could switch off critical infrastructures if not well enough protected. But in fact, we don't know how well our infrastructures are really protected. We've seen some manipulations of critical infrastructures all around the globe recently. Further on, there are challenges that could be even on a much smaller time scale. The financial system might potentially collapse. At least we didn't leave the financial crisis behind. And also conflict or war could happen anytime. So we need to be better prepared for these kind of situations. It's clear that certain challenges will come, and one of them could also be actually a global pandemic. Now, this is the more serious as our antibiotics are becoming less and less effective, the more and more multi-resistant bacteria. And so basically, even those bacteria that we thought we could control might come back and pose new risks. So the question is, how can we address all these problems? Do they have something in common? Well, there is this old approach, we know it very well, that's what scientists used to do. We went to a library, we were trying to find the right kind of literature, we were reading a lot of books to get an overview, and then we identified the gaps in the knowledge. We employed PhD students to fill these gaps, and postdocs too, of course, and that took a few years, and then eventually a gap was filled. And it produced even more books, so eventually, you know, after a couple of decades, that would even go into a regulation. And so, basically, from the identification of a problem until the problem is fixed, it easily takes 30 years on average. And one of the reasons is that basically old knowledge that we've learned some time back stands in the way of innovation. So Max Planck therefore said, science advances funeral by funeral. Well, what do we do in a time that's changing so quickly that we can't wait for these funerals any longer to make progress? That's a question that John Brockman was asking recently in a provocative way. And we're really in deep trouble because we need more speed, more capacity, more impact when it comes to producing new results. And so fortunately, there is a powerful method that has been developed recently, which is evidence-based decision-making using big data. We'll look into this a little bit more. Obviously, by now, there's huge amounts of data that are being collected every single second about what we are doing. So, what we're writing on the web, what we're shopping, where we're moving, all of these things are basically recorded, and this can be used in order to get a better idea of what is going on in our economy and society. And so, basically, the expectations of decision makers are that you would get answers to your problems basically in a second. In the very same way as we Google to find out about something. So we enter our question, we'll get results, and then it may not be the perfect result, but at least we can take some action. Within just 60 seconds of time, 700,000 search queries are being sent, and 500,000 Facebook posts. So this is a hell lot of data. And it's no wonder that people are now saying, okay, data is the new oil. It's a resource that you can make money with, and if you look at companies in the Silicon Valley, you can make a lot of money with this, billions of dollars. Even with open data, you can make 3 to 5 trillions a year. And that's quite a lot. That means it's $700 per person per year extra. That's quite nice. So it's important that we make sure that we would get a piece of this cake, right? But for this, we need to learn how to drill and distill the data. And that's not so simple anymore. I'll address that in my other talk this afternoon. So let's spend a little bit of time on what you can do with big data. You can use it for good. You can craft new instruments to explore the world. You can map the world in the first place. So you collect all the data, and if you do that well, then basically you can create a picture of the world. I'll come to this in detail later on. With all this information, you can create compasses for decision makers. Rather than just looking into a GDP per capita for a country with a delay of so and so many months, we could now get disaggregated data, could get it at a finger snip. We could measure other things that are important, such as environmental conditions, social capital, such as reputation and trust, which is a basis also for economic development, but also the happiness of people. All of these things now become measurable. We could understand the spreading of international tension, and we could also better prepare for the spreading of diseases such as Ebola. And so we're learning a lot about problems that have been bothering us in the past. But also more positive things like innovation, the production of knowledge and the consumption of knowledge can now be measured. So we've been looking in citation data, and you can basically see the flow of ideas from one country to another, from one city to another, and it's quite interesting to identify the most productive places in the world. You can also zoom into this and look at the spreading of ideas, of memes, of physical concepts, for example, and this map has been automatically produced over here, showing the most important subjects in physics. And even though I studied physics, I should say, it was never so clear as it became when I saw this picture. When I looked at it, I said, yes, this is what actually happened. And usually we have so much noise around this, so it's sometimes really difficult actually to see what is going on. So these things become measurable, and also we can map cultural spreading. For example, we've been looking into birth-death data of notable people over a time period of 2,000 years. Now, that's a long time ago. I would think, oh, probably there's not much information left about these times, but you would be surprised how much you can reconstruct from this birth-death data alone. Now add all this other information that we still have about these times, we could do many more things. So we can see in the movies that you can find on YouTube how culture spread in Europe. You can also see how America was basically discovered culturally. Yeah. So you see people are arriving at the East Coast, and eventually they explore the entire country and end up at the West Coast. So this is pretty fascinating, and this is just the beginning of what we can do with all these cultural data. Now, given that we can do so many amazing things with data that is now becoming available, would we still need science? And sorry to say this, but I see you're studying science, but there's Chris Anderson who said, there will be the end of theory. The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. So we just have enough data, he said, quantity turns into quality, and basically machine learning algorithms will be able to identify everything that is important automatically in these data. Is this really true? Well, hopefully not, because otherwise you should better become a data analyst, right? Is big data a universal tool, as is sometimes claimed, to understand the world and govern it? Can we know everything? In principle, certainly we're measuring more and more data about the world, and in perspective, perhaps we could have the perfect measurement of the entire world. What would be the implications of this? Could we create a crystal ball? Could we see everything in the world in real time as it happens, and maybe even predict the future? Well, if we wanted to do this, certainly we needed to make sure that the course of the world stays predictable, and that's why we would need to be able to influence it. And so, first of all, we would have to figure out how the world should evolve. We would probably use huge computers in order to optimize the state of the world and try to do this. And with this, the question is, could we act like a wise king? Could we find the perfect decisions and put them into practice? Well, in order to put them into practice, we would also have to be powerful. We would have to be able to influence people to do the right thing. Yeah? If selfishness was bad for the evolution of the system, we would have to make them less selfish, for example. And, well, if it's really true that knowledge is power, then knowing everything would make whoever has all this information would make him basically almighty, right? I mean, it's kind of a technocratic vision, and some people would say, okay, this is a technological implementation of God. Yeah, it's provocative here. Yeah, but I think it's very important that we go through this argument to realize what's possible and what's not, or what's desirable and what's not. So for this to happen, we would need to be able to manipulate people's decisions. And that could be done with information. In fact, I mean, this is happening to a certain extent already. All the personalized advertisement that you see while you browse the web is trying to make you do certain kind of things. So, is this perfectionizable? Well, it will stay a dream, I would say, for a number of reasons. The big data and the crucible approach are certainly powerful, but they do have some problems too. And one of the problems is that we find correlations in the data, patterns. But these patterns don't always need to have a causal meaning. They don't have to say, if we do this, then that will happen. For example, we see patterns in the sky, although most likely that they don't have a real meaning. And let's take, for example, this graph over here. It's showing a spurious correlation. Yeah? So if you show number of serial killers as a function of chocolate consumption, yeah, it would be very dangerous to live in Switzerland. Unfortunately, this is just a spurious correlation, so I don't need to be afraid. But the problem is that we might find such kind of correlations and patterns, and we might think they're important, and maybe they're not. And of course, no matter how much data you have, there's still this problem that you need to distinguish different cases, say good risks and bad risks, and usually you don't have a clear separation of these cases. So there's an overlap of the data points, and it's hard to say, is somebody really a terrorist or not? And for that reason, there will be mistakes in the classification, mistakes of first and second kind. That means there will be false alarms, where we accuse somebody to have bad intentions while this is not the case. And there are other cases where somebody has bad intentions and we wouldn't notice until it happens. And we've seen in Paris recently, unfortunately. Now, such classification errors would happen also in other contexts, like insurance contracts, or if banks give a loan to you or not and have to decide what interest rates you should pay. And so there would be lucky people who just get a better condition than they should get, and other people who get bad conditions, although they should get a better one. So there will be discrimination. And the more data we have, the more dimensions we distinguish, potentially more discrimination will we have. So we need to think about this. And there's a third source of errors, which is we could choose the wrong kind of model. Yeah? Maybe a linear model is not the right thing to choose. So what kind of model should we choose? Even more obvious is the situation for the choice of a goal function. If you want to optimize a system, assume you have a powerful enough computer to do this. But for an optimization, you always need to have a goal function. What is it that you're going to optimize? And it's not so clear what would be the right goal function. Maximize money, maximize survivability, maximize satisfaction. What is it? So, if there is this one decision maker, this wise king, he would have to make up his mind. What is it that I'm going to optimize? And maybe the problem is to decide for one goal. Maybe it's better if there are many different institutions that have at least slightly different goals. And we'll come back to this later on. So, no doubt, big data allows for evidence-based decision-making and big improvements, but it's not the ultimate solution. We also see that over here. There's another problem. And this relates actually to Moore's law. So as you can see in the blue curve, the processing power increases exponentially, doubles every 18 months approximately. But the data volume increases even faster. It doubles every 12 months. That's the green curve. So what's happening is we're getting from an age where we didn't have enough data to take good decisions towards an age where we can make evidence-based decisions using big data. But as you can see over here, there is a gap between the data volume and the processing power. And that gap becomes larger and larger. In fact, the proportion of data that you can process is decreasing more and more over time. That means there's a decreasing percentage of data that you can even look at. And that means the large majority of data eventually, in perspective, will be dark data. It's somewhere, but you cannot process it. And then you have to decide, okay, what kind of data am I going to process? And that creates what I call the flashlight effect. You could put the spotlight on basically anything you're interested in, but you wouldn't see the stuff around it. And that means you pay too much attention to certain things while you overlook other things. And this is not a theoretical effect, because most people haven't seen the financial crisis coming. Yeah? Despite big data, that was already there at that time in America. They didn't see the Arab Spring coming. They didn't see the crisis in Ukraine coming. And also the response to Ebola was much too late. Yeah, it was more or less in the last moment. So this is the problem. While we are paying attention to one challenge, we tend to overlook other challenges that are already emerging. But things are more serious than this even, because systemic complexity, that's the red curve, is increasing even faster. And that means that not even all the data and all the processing power in the world will allow you to keep control or to optimize the system in real time. That's kind of paradoxical. You would think that the more computer power you have, the more should you be able to gain control. But the opposite is the case, and the reason is that we go on networking the world. Yeah? So that creates ever more possibilities and ever more complexity in a factorial way. And the question is, how can we deal with this? Fortunately, there is complexity science. Yeah. And it allows us to understand the kinds of problems we are facing. First of all, just for the sake of completeness, I'm mentioning that we need to distinguish complicated and complex systems. So complicated systems, like cars, they consist of many parts, but these parts are in a certain position and serve a certain function. They're well controllable altogether. There are few degrees of freedom. So with the steering wheel and the gas and the brake, you can basically control the entire system. In contrast, traffic flow is a complex dynamical system where each of the parts, in this case each driver vehicle unit, can separately adjust to other parts in the system. And it creates a collective dynamics that may not be understandable from the properties of the single parts. The interactions are becoming the dominant force, basically, of determining the system behavior. And so one of the problems that cause trouble in the real world is unstable dynamics. We probably know it best from weather forecasts. There are principal limits of predictability. Even if we had a weather station every single centimeter, as much data as you want, it would not be possible to predict the weather over a time period of a month or a year or 5 years. Why? Because the physics behind this, which is the physics of turbulence, doesn't allow this to happen. According to the physics of turbulence, it's similar in a certain sense to deterministic chaos. The slightest change in the initial condition would, after some time, lead to completely different outcomes, known as butterfly effect. And so there is another problem, like control of these systems is difficult. For example, this is a predator-prey system, and say the hunter would like to get the system towards this point. Well, if you try to do this, then most likely the system is going to end up in a completely different place. Or take this system, of course well known to you, first order phase transition at a tipping point. But the issue is that if you want to control a system, like a company or an economy or a society, then in many cases, there's not much happening. Yeah? You're making an attempt, you have the best intentions, but the system doesn't do what you want it to do. System cannot be controlled like a bus. So you're putting more force in the system, you're trying harder, and still maybe nothing happens, or not to the extent that it should. And then you're trying even harder, and suddenly the system changes abruptly, but not always in the way that you want it to change. So, that means managing complex systems is really difficult. as this example shows. So people are driving in a circle, and that shouldn't be a difficult task. Yeah? Everyone has a good driver education, sees what's going on, but still a phantom traffic jam is occurring. So why is this? Well, if you would ask the drivers, they would probably say there was a stupid driver in front of me who didn't know how to drive a car. But of course, you know well that there are mathematical equations describing these kind of phenomena. And basically, these equations say if the density is above a certain critical density, that means the distances between cars get smaller than a certain amount, then the traffic flow will be unstable. That means the slightest variation in the speed of a car will cause a ripple effect. The next driver will have to respond to this, but that happens with a delay. And in order to compensate for the delay, this driver has to brake a little bit harder. On the next one, even harder. So there's an amplification effect and a chain reaction, domino effect, you could say. And as a result, in the end, the cars get to stop, although no driver wants this to happen. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only unstable complex dynamical system that we know. What worries here is that if you're facing a complex dynamical system that is unstable, then no matter how hard you try, no matter how good your technology almost, how much information you have, this system is likely to get out of control sooner or later, with some restrictions. If you cannot push the system into a stable parameter regime, that can sometimes be done with technology, in fact. Here's another example. So normally pedestrians self-organize. You can see these lanes of uniform walking direction, and that produces actually pretty efficient flows and little friction in the system. It's interesting, of course, it doesn't take a policeman or any traffic signs or any laws. It's just happening automatically. However, if the density is too high, then again the system might get out of control, and in fact a crowd disaster might happen. As unfortunately we've seen that many times in the past. So even if all these people in the crowd are peaceful, not aggressive at all in their intentions, the situation might totally get out of control and people might die. Now, the situation is even more complicated in networks, because one single event could trigger certain other events. Moreover, one event not only can trigger several events, but the same event could be triggered by different causes. And there are delays also, so in many cases it's difficult really to identify the cause-effect relationships. Most of these processes are probabilistic on top of this. So they might sometimes happen and sometimes they don't happen. That really makes it difficult to identify the likely outcomes. Moreover, you could see that actually, one event triggers 3 events, and these events again trigger more than one event. So it's not just a domino effect, it's actually a cascade effect that becomes more and more serious the more it spreads. And unfortunately, the financial crisis seems to be of this kind. Here, the cascade effect hasn't stopped yet. In these kind of systems, a single local perturbation could mess up your entire system. And this is just an experiment, right, for a rainy weekend. So take mouse traps and some table tennis balls and then get into this nice experiment. Now this experiment has been invented to represent chain reactions as we see them in nuclear fission. And we know nuclear fission is a process that can be controlled, otherwise we wouldn't have nuclear power stations. But it's difficult to control these processes, and sometimes, as we've seen in Fukushima and elsewhere, these processes can get out of control. Now, what if we have similar processes in economic and social systems, just in a much slower scale? So it doesn't look like an explosion as this does, but in fact it might be similarly difficult to control. And in fact, I personally believe these kind of processes exist, and a political revolution could be such a thing. So we certainly don't want such a thing to happen. But in order to avoid these things from happening, we need to understand them better. Here is a real-life example: bankruptcies of banks in the United States after the failure of Lehman Brothers. So what you can see over here, hundreds of banks have failed, causing hundreds of billions of losses, and this looked very similar to the experiment we've seen before. Hopefully this is not an experiment. And again, a similar example is that of blackouts of power grids. And believe it or not, in 2006 there was an example where a ship had to be transferred and power line had to be turned off for some time. Of course, that was simulated before, but then there was a spontaneous failure of another line, and that together triggered a cascade of events. Within seconds, many power stations were taken off the net, and eventually we had blackouts all over Europe, thousands of kilometers away. How can such a thing happen? And why is it that, here there's still light, and here and here and here there's a blackout? It's a very difficult pattern to understand, but here is a computer simulation. Oops. So you can see there's a failure here in the beginning, and then it spreads, but still here in the neighborhood there is light. The largest damage is actually caused over here, far away from Spain. This time it was spreading in the other way around. So it's really kind of surprising to see this kind of dynamics. But things are even more concerning than this, because we have interdependencies between networks of networks. And so the blackout is usually just the beginning, and then this has impact on traffic, on communication, on gas stations, on water supply, and many other things. So there is a cascade through many different kinds of systems. So for example, if there is a thunderstorm, and I could have many different results. Still, if we carefully analyze these kind of things, we can identify certain logical cascades. Because some systems are dependent on others, and that determines a causal interdependency. And once we have created such a diagram, we can say that there are things that happen first, there are things that happen second, and there are things that happen even later. We can say that if this didn't happen, then that's not going to happen. All of that is useful information and allows us to prepare for such kind of events and it allows us to anticipate what might happen next. So we can actually take proactive measure than just wait and see what happens, and then respond with a delay. I think this is very important, and I personally believe that many disaster response actions can actually accelerate it. And this is important because the first hours and the first days are usually the most important ones. It's interesting to look into this risk interconnection map that the World Economic Forum produces every year. And if you do this, then you will recognize that surprisingly now economic disparity and global governance failures and other socio-economic political problems are actually the biggest problems in the world. Not environmental problems anymore, or technological challenges. So we need to understand society much better. This is really the greatest challenge right now. And as I've said before, we might easily run into many different problems. We don't know exactly which kind of problems will happen and when it will happen. But we need to be much better prepared in order to survive all these challenges. We could have a third world war, we could have a financial system collapse, and as I said, global pandemic. So we need to turn our Earth into an Ark in Noah, and we need to take action to preserve cultural diversity, because culture is basically a collection of success principles to respond to certain kinds of situations and challenges. And every culture has different ways of doing this. So there's a lot of value in culture. There's not one superior culture. Every culture is important in the very same way as we need to protect biodiversity. Do we need to protect social diversity? And I think there's still a large amount of cultural analphabetism. In fact, one could almost say that it's like the times when we didn't have letters and writing for our language. Because if I would ask you what are kind of the 1,000 most important rules of your culture that make your culture successful, you would probably have difficulties to formulate this in words, and even more difficulties to formulate this in mathematical formulas. So it's surprising how little we know about the most important success principles of our societies. This is what we need to do. We need to create this alphabet for the cultures in the world. We need to preserve this cultural diversity. And we need to build a more resilient, a smarter society that can deal with all sorts of problems. Whatever might happen, it's important that our society can respond flexibly to anything. And there are a number of principles that we know matter for resilience. So we can apply them to build a smarter or more resilient society. And one of these things, and coming back to the Gordian knot that I showed in the beginning, is we need to cut it. And it took nobody less than Alexander the Great to do this. So why cut? Because in a complex global system, I think what helps to protect parts of the system is modularity. I think that's something that we haven't paid enough attention to. In fact, there are a number of drivers that steadily increase systemic risk, such as we are reducing redundancies, because redundancy is costly. We network systems more and more. Complexity increases, dynamics is faster, and there's also a high pace of innovation, and we don't know beforehand in many cases whether that's going to produce problems or solutions, or both. But we know that systemic resilience can be increased by a number of mechanisms, such as backup strategies, redundancies, reserves, and alternatives. And one thing that I'm really surprised about is that we just have one financial system, or I didn't notice something. So why do we have just one financial system and no backup for this? Then simplification, limitation of system size can help. Less connectivity or decoupling strategies. Diversity, again, very important. Real-time measurement and adaptive feedback to stabilize the system. Transparency and awareness, accountability and responsibility, suitable incentives, collective intelligence. So these are things that we can do. These are the design principles of a resilient system. And so in any network, we should have engineered breaking points to be able to stop cascades. In fact, in principle, we know this. We have these fuses in every household. And why? Because a local overload shouldn't burn your house down. Why didn't we have that in our financial system? So I think what's needed is that economists sit down together with engineers, and maybe also natural scientists and complexity scientists in particular, to figure out how this financial architecture would need to look like. Altogether, we certainly need to understand our world better. Sometimes I think we understand our universe, all the stars. We understand that better than our own planet and what's happening on the planet. And so the question is it a lost battle against all this complexity, against all this sudden change? Well, maybe not. We need to think differently about systems. We've learned, for example, to control forces of nature, many of them. Like an explosion, right, can be turned into a directed motion. In fact, if you were not aware of this, in your car, there are explosions all the time, and actually several thousand per minute. Yeah? So, or per hour. Anyway, so this is something that we should guide our thinking. The question is, what are the forces that are changing our society and our economy? And how can we actually use them to our advantage? If we understand them, we wouldn't have to fight against them. We could turn these forces into design principles for social systems. And in fact, complexity science can deliver explanatory models. And I'll give you some examples from our own work. Flu prediction. As you know, there is Google Flu Trend. And this basically is trying to find out how many people are ill based on what they're looking for. Say, I have a headache, I have fever, whatever, it will basically come up with an index, and the index is estimating the number of people who are ill. Unfortunately, it's not always as perfect as it should be, and so the question is, are there other methods? In fact, what we've done in a publication in Science recently is that we've used much less data, but we have combined different kinds of data sets, and we have combined that with a model. So if you look at the spreading of diseases in space and time, then it looks pretty chaotic. You look at it and say, oh, that really doesn't make any sense. And you see that actually in these widely scattered data clouds, there is no systematics in it. And the reason for this is that we are all flying by plane. And while we're flying by plane, we're also potentially transmitting diseases, even if it's just the flu. Now, if we take this knowledge on board, that means travel volumes by airplanes, then we can define an effective distance measure. And that means airports that have a lot of passenger volume transported between them are effectively close to each other, and places that have little passenger volume are effectively distant, even though they might be next to each other on a geographic map. And if you do this, then you see suddenly you have these linear interdependencies. That means your system becomes predictable. You can also look at the spreading patterns from every single airport in the world, and then one of them will basically make the spreading pattern most circular. That identifies you the source of the disease, which actually in the beginning is often not so well known. And it's very important to identify the first case and why the disease broke out in the first place. But once you have identified the outbreak location, together with this circular spreading in the effective distance, you can also predict what are the cities which will be hit next by the flu, which are the cities that come second next, and so on. So in principle, if you have limited medical resources, you can have them in place in those cities that are hit next, and this way also contain diseases more efficiently. As you know, we have also produced models for traffic flows that can produce empirical effects quite well, produced models for pedestrian crowds, models for opinion formation. And we've also come up with models that allow us to understand human coordination, the self-organization of behavioral conventions, the breakdown or outbreak of cooperation, or even the evolution of moral behavior. And also the evolution of social preferences, the emergence of social norms, spreading of conflict, and all of this is, as much as we can, also tested in the lab or in web experiments. So we're trying to bring models and experiments together as much as we can with the limited capacity we have. So I personally believe that complexity science can make major contributions to addressing long-standing problems and come up with entirely new solutions. But that means to go away from our current organization, to a certain extent at least, which is, well, more or less like an instruction manual. We have thousands or tens of thousands of laws. I think there's nobody on earth who can really know all these. And we know that this is producing even more complicated situations. So many managers and politicians too are complaining about over-regulation. And so the question is, would there be a better, a more efficient way of organizing systems? And the answer is, yes, maybe we can have some systems that themselves self-organize. But that requires a proper system design. Now, what's so special about this system design? Why does it work so well? It has a reason. The reason is that we have a unidirectional road over here. In the back, there is also a unidirectional road in the opposite direction. And in the middle, there is a buffer. And this buffer allows you to adjust your speed such that you arrive just at the point in time where there is a gap for you in the traffic flow. these three elements together produce your more or less perfect self-organization. Now, we are also learning now to build smart grids that would match production and consumption of energy better, that it would also be organized in a more decentralized way. We've learned how to avoid crowd disasters, and actually many measures were taken, among them avoiding crossing flows, but also real-time monitoring and adaptive rerouting. That means real-time feedback to the actual situation. There are also solutions to overcome congestion to a certain extent. So at the moment, we're still simulating this annoying stop-and-go traffic that we know in Europe and many other places of the world. Maybe it happens sometimes here as well. And I've already explained you the mechanism why this is happening. Now let's look a little bit more into this detail. We're elevating ourselves, and what we can see now is there is a on-ramp. Cars are trying to get into the freeway. It produces small perturbations. Those perturbations are amplified, and that causes the stop-and-go traffic eventually. What we'll do is we'll equip these cars with radar sensors that measure the distance and relative velocities, and let the cars drive automatically in a better way. So it avoids delays in adaptation. And we call this a traffic assistance system, because not only changing the driver comfort of a single car, but it has collective effects. As you can see, even though the inflow stays the same, there's no congestion anymore. So mechanism design, real-time feedback, is kind of the trick to get rid of this problem. Yes, in fact, now cars are becoming more and more intelligent. Yeah? They have perception, in a sense, of onboard data acquisition. They have inter-vehicle communication. There is adaptive choice of the driving strategy. That means decision-making. And yeah, this is quite promising for the future of traffic. We've done that with Volkswagen together, and this has been tested in real life, as you've seen in the video in the corner down right. So what we do here is also integrate different sources of information to get a better picture of the situation, and then respond in a specific way. So these are three of the model parameters of the model that describe driver behavior, and also control the driver assistance system. So what you see is that under certain conditions, we're changing the parameters by a certain factor. And so, for example, within the area of congestion, we are reducing the time gap, and at the downstream end of congestion, we're increasing the acceleration. In this way, we're increasing the capacity and are stabilizing the traffic flow. And you can see, even when not all the vehicles are equipped with this technology, we can see dramatic effects. So a large reduction in congestion. And this is very interesting. Now, the question is, can we transfer these self-organization principles from technological systems to social systems? And social systems don't work like a clock. They're not deterministic systems. And also, it's good that there are deterministic systems, because otherwise we wouldn't have innovations, right? So there's some problems that I haven't addressed so far in my talk, which is environmental exploitation or overfishing or environmental pollution. These problems are known as social dilemma situations. In these situations, it would be good if everyone would be cooperative. It would be good for everyone. But if everyone else is cooperative and you aren't, there are additional advantages for you. And in the very same way as free traffic flow in the circle was the desirable state but unstable, and therefore we ended up with congestion, is cooperation unstable in the social dilemma situations? Because there is a temptation not to cooperate. And then, the more people don't cooperate, the less likely is that other people will still cooperate. And that leads you into a tragedy of the commons where nobody or very few people will still cooperate. And that's bad for everyone. In fact, these kind of cooperation problems exist since the earliest days of humanity. So, for example, you could hunt a rabbit alone, or you could hunt a stag, but you would have to cooperate. Or the public goods game, either everyone makes a contribution, or some people don't. So these are really old problems, and you could say you can tell history in two ways. The one way of telling history is a series of wars and heroes and losers. And the other way is you look into the cultural achievements that created social order. This is the key challenge. And of course, we are starting here from the social dilemma, such as the prisoner's dilemma. We need to turn this into another kind of game that would allow cooperation to happen. And there are a number of different approaches. So there are centralized institutions that can maintain cooperation, and it's kind of a powerful state that would basically enforce it. Or genetic favoritism, as evolutionary biologists would call it. So basically, if you're related genetically with somebody, there's a biological incentive basically to give an advantage. Or police, or courts. These are kind of the centralized institutions basically that try to enforce cooperation, and also special kinds of taxes too. But interestingly, besides the state institution, there are also other institutions that are decentralized. And some of them have become famous in the context of religions. So important are they. So, as you may know from the Old Testament, there is this saying, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, right? So you pay back, you retaliate. This is basically one of the oldest peer-to-peer mechanisms to establish social order and cooperation. But we know it has unwanted side effects, right? For example, blood revenge, and that could cascade and never stop. Peer punishment is something that we find in social norms, and in fact, it can be shown to be quite effective. So, in a social dilemma game, usually the cooperation would eventually go down, as Ernst Fehr and others have measured. This is an experiment that followed this up. And if you allow for two systems, one system that doesn't allow people to punish a non-cooperative behavior, and an institution where a system where you can punish non-cooperative people, people would move from the non-punishing system to the punishing system, because only then they can establish cooperation. Then there is a mechanism of direct reciprocity, and basically friendship. But too much friendship also has side effects like corruption. So maybe there are even better mechanisms, and in fact we now see indirect reciprocity spread through reputation systems. And these reputation systems are actually good for both sides. Customers would get a better service. The sellers would be able to sell their services at a higher price if they have a good reputation. But again, there is a side effect that if we have this personalized recommender system, we might end up living in filter bubbles, right? And so, in particular, we need to make sure that diversity is maintained. Of course, if you all buy the same music and go to the same movie, this is probably not so good altogether. Now, it's interesting to look, of course, into the competition of different kinds of mechanisms. In particular, is punishment the best mechanism or not? And so we looked into this, where two teams were competing with each other, and one of the team had a punishment strategy, and the other team had a signaling strategy. And it turns out punishment is effective, but it's expensive. And altogether, the signaling strategy, and one particular case, so-called altruistic signaling, is even more efficient. So all of this is about coordination, in fact. If you have a mechanism that allows people to coordinate, that in itself might be enough to establish cooperation. And here's one more mechanism which is really exciting, which is if you match people who are more cooperative with other people who are more cooperative, and people who are less cooperative with other people who are less cooperative, this is producing a trend towards more cooperation. That means then you just have to get above this level of cooperation here, and the system will automatically driven to a highly cooperative system. So this is an extremely promising new development, and then we did some experiments to check this prediction, and we were surprised that in reality things are even better than the rational choice models would predict, because not only is high meritocracy producing high contributions, I mean high levels of cooperation, but it's also overcoming the trade-off between efficiency and equality, as you can see over here, because not only the payoff is best in the highly meritocratic system, but also the unfairness or inequality is actually lowest. So this is really very interesting, and with all these mechanisms, we have mechanisms at hand to support cooperation in social systems. So we can design social order, in a sense, in a social system if we have just the mechanisms in place. But here one more important thing. What we have done is we looked into this idea that's still widespread in economics, that people would be selfish. They're just perfect, more or less perfect optimizers of their own interests. And in order to check this hypothesis of the Homo economicus, we did an evolutionary simulation with really harsh biological competition. And here the agents decide according to a best response rule. That means they optimize the utility function given the behaviors of the interaction partners. Now, importantly, the utility function considers not only the own payoff, but gives a certain weight to the payoff of their interaction partners. And this weight is called the friendliness. Most importantly, however, we set this friendliness to 0 in the beginning. Yeah? I mean, everyone is unfriendly. Everyone is selfish. Very bad rules in the beginning. But the friendliness trait is then inherited to offspring, to children, and the likelihood to have an offspring increases with the payoff. Not the utility function. Yeah? Only what you actually get determines the number of your children. The payoff is assumed to be 0 if everyone is unfriendly to you and exploits you. That means you won't have any children if you're cooperative and nobody else is. And finally, friendliness is inherited as in biology, so children tend to have the same value of friendliness, but there's a mutation rate too. And now the question is, what happens in such a system? Well, as you expect, for most parameter combinations, you end up with the Homo economicus. But most importantly, there is an area where we find a Homo socialis, that means other regarding decision makers that are friendly. And this happens when children are grown up next to their parents, as humans do it usually. This is highly important because it allows to increase the payoff and overcome the tragedy of the commons. Basically, the point is that if I'm friendly to you and you're friendly to others, then others are likely to be friendly to me, and it's good for all of us. Yeah? The tricky part is, though, to get from this selfish regime towards the cooperative regime. And in the beginning, it's really a harsh situation. So the first cooperator will be exploited, will have no offspring in this simulation, will be a life of tears, a terrible life, in fact, and no children. But what happens is that through mutations, there will be small friendliness values occurring in the population. And it might be enough friendliness for a single cooperative individual to turn them into cooperators. So this is conditional cooperativeness. So what happens is that eventually there will be conditional cooperators that still defect, they don't cooperate. And one day, due to mutations, there will be one unconditional cooperators, and that one person might turn the others in a positive cascade effect into cooperative people. And then eventually, cooperation pays off and spreads, and cooperators have children, many children. So, as you can see, no friendliness in the beginning, but eventually, after a number of generations, there is a broad distribution of friendliness values. And this is actually well compatible with experimental results of a colleague of mine. And even Adam Smith knew about it. He just never got into economic theory. He said, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render the happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it. Now, what I'm saying is, we will have to rewrite economic theory, considering that many people in the world by now are other regarding. So, while economics 1.0 was for the Homo economicus, was for self-regarding decision makers, we need to develop an economic theory and economic institutions for other regarding behavior. And here are some snapshots of computer simulations. We've also assumed two populations here in the beginning that are genetically not related, and what you see is not only the emergence of fairness preferences and other regarding behavior, but you also actually see the emergence of cooperation among strangers. And so eventually we learn to cooperate with each other. Eventually we learn that being nice to each other pays off. And with this, I'm closing my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for a wonderful talk. So many thoughts there, so many ideas, and I'm sure there are also lots of questions.